This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
So let's pick up with this principle of temptation. Lead us not into temptation. What an odd thing to say when you think about it, because really, doesn't the Bible say, for example, in James chapter 1, verse 13, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. So, what does this mean? God, don't lead us into temptation. What is the idea there? Well, the key to understanding is the word. The key to understanding this is the word lead. The word literally means to carry or to deliver to the edge. It's like it was a word that was used often to take something and put it on a doorstep, for example. The idea is that it's a word picture of somebody bringing something and leaving it right at the edge or right at the door. So the idea here is, God, don't leave me when I'm at the point of temptation. That's really what it's saying. That's the idea. You know, when I get right to the edge, God, don't abandon me. Don't leave me at that point. Now, when we talk about temptation, we sometimes get confused between temptation and sin. They're two different things. Temptation is, remember, let me draw this diagram, this word image, if you will. Think of sin is being out of God's will. We define sin as being out of God's will. If this is God's island of God's will, right here where I'm standing. Let's say this is the island, and I'm standing in God's will. When I'm in God's will, I'm right where, I'm obviously where God wants me. I'm doing what God wants me to do. I have a great relationship with Him. Things are going well. My life is cooking along. That doesn't mean I don't have problems. I will have problems, but I'm dealing with them the way God wants me to deal with them. And there's a blessing in all of that. Apart from the island, off the island is this, call it the sea of sin, the sin sea. All of you are in there, by the way. And out in the sin sea is the lying, stealing, cheating, and spitting in the sea. And so if I want to sin, I have to get off of the island. I can't lie, steal, cheat, or spit in the sea when I'm standing up here on the island. If I want to lie, I have to get off of the island to lie. That's sin is the condition of being out of God's will. So sin is a condition that may or may not reveal itself in an action. Because there are a lot of people who are off the island of God's will. They never lie, they never steal, they never cheat, they never spit and seek, they never do anything wrong. They're morally good people. But if they're not on the island of God's will, they're in the sea of sin. So it's important to understand that key principle. Sin isn't necessarily a bunch of things that you do wrong. It's the condition of where you are, either in God's will or out of God's will. And it may reveal itself in certain actions in your life. So, when I am tempted, temptation is the desire to get out of God's will. Temptation is that idea of going right up to the edge, as we've defined the word. Of going right up to the edge and going, boy, do I want to or don't I? Yeah, I want to, but am I going to? That's temptation. Temptation is not a sin. Temptation is thinking about sin. Getting to that point where you're about to step out of God's will. Now, it can so consume you that it becomes sin, and that becomes the actions itself, where you are completely thinking about that instead of thinking of God's will and what it is that God wants for your life. But temptation, in general, the general sense of temptation is that it is that desire to get out of God's will, that idea that I'm going to get out of God's will. That's why when Jesus was talking about one time to the Pharisees, and they said, well, you said that don't commit adultery, but I say that if you have thought it in your heart, you've already committed adultery. What he was saying was, when that so consumes you, that becomes the sin. You may not have actually committed the action, but you're out of God's will. You've already, you're already off the island thinking about this, planning it. It's going through your mind. It's controlling your thoughts. That becomes the sin. So temptation is kind of a gray area, if you will, where you're not in sin yet, but it can become sin even if you don't commit what the temptation is to commit. It's just that idea that if it begins to consume the way you think and the way your mindset, that in itself becomes a sin. So, this is when Jesus says, pray this way, don't lead us into temptation. What he's saying is, God, don't abandon us when we get to the edge, when we don't want to get out of your will, but we start playing these tapes around in our head and things begin to look differently to us. It's an acknowledgement that we are weak. And that's really what this part of the prayer is saying. Don't lead us into temptation, God. Don't abandon us because we're weak. And we need God's strength. We're dependent on his watchful, loving protection. And without him, we're vulnerable and we're complicit to sin. In fact, 1 Corinthians 10:13 says it this way. No temptation has seized you except that which is common to man. In other words, when temptation hits, it grabs you, but it doesn't seize you until you have made the choice for it to have control over your life. And that's the way man acts. It's common. That's the way it happens. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. There's the proof right there that God's not going to let you just step over the edge if you don't want to. You know, he's not going to let you be tempted beyond what you can handle in your life. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so you can stand up under it. When the temptation comes, when the trial comes in your life and you're tempted to step out of God's will, God says, I'll provide a way where you can stay in my will and you can deal with this issue in your life.